Welcome back to Inherent Board Games. Today we continue our People's Choice Top 100 Board Games of All Time, covering games number 20 through 11. We've surveyed over 3,300 board game designers, publishers, reviewers, content creators, and enthusiasts, and these are the results we've come up with. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. The People's Choice number 20 board game of all time is Seven Wonders, designed by Antoine Boza, and this game has been around for over 10 years now, and it still holds a very strong spot in the eyes of the fans. This game here last year was actually ranked number 12, just missed the top 10. This year, it's still holding on tight. It's dropped down 8 spots, but it's still at least within the top 20. And Seven Wonders is basically the quintessential pick and pass card drafting game where players are basically building a civilization from its early stages all the way throughout history, and they're doing this through the process of drafting cards. And there's a pick and pass card drafting mechanism where players are going to start with a hand of cards at the beginning of each round or each age. They're going to pick one card and pass the rest of the hand to the next player clockwise or counterclockwise depending on the round. And these cards are going to do different things for you. They're going to produce resources. They're going to help you develop your science or your culture in your civilization. They're going to help you do different market-related actions. They're going to help you accrue money, and money is one of the ways that you can score points, and it's also one of the things, something that's very useful to purchase other particular actions and or cards. And players are basically trying to grow their civilization in 7 different categories. I like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Seven Wonders as their number 1 board game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 20. The People's Choice number 19 board game of all time is Great Western Trail, designed by Alexander Pfister. And Great Western Trail is another game that's holding on tight to its spot. It was actually ranked number 17 last year, only dropped down 2 spots, and I think one of the reasons why is because of other iterations that have been recently released and or announced, not to mention the second edition to the game. Now, Great Western Trail has a 19th century setting where players are taking on the role of ranchers or cattle herders from Texas who are breeding and raising up their livestock, in particular their cattle, and they're trying to ship them via train from Texas all the way to Kansas City. This action is going to earn you money and victory points, but along the way, you also want to make sure that you use the various buildings that are along this Great Western Trail. Players are going to be hiring their staff along the way, cowboys in order to help them with the herding of the cattle, craftsmen in order to help them with the erecting of the buildings, and engineers as well. This game features mechanisms such as deck building, hand management, set collection, and point-to-point movement. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Great Western Trail as their number 1 board game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 19. The People's Choice number 18 board game of all time is Spirit Island. And Spirit Island, another game that's holding on steady. This game actually ranked 19 last year. It actually bumped up 1 spot. And it's a very popular cooperative board game. It's not the most popular cooperative board game. There are a few other co-op games that are higher than this on the list, but it's definitely among the most popular. And Spirit Island is basically also the heaviest of the Euro-style co-op games where players are basically taking on the role of the island, the Spirit Island, and they're fending off potential settlers who are trying to exploit the land. Each player represents a different spirit with its own unique elemental power. Players are paying energy in order to play their power cards. And if they're able to use a particular combination of power cards that match their own spirit's elemental affinities, then that's going to grant them additional bonus effects. Now, little by little, these settlers are expanding. They are setting up camps. They are fighting off against the natives of the island and ravaging and exploiting the land. And there are these native neutral pieces. Well, not really neutral. They're kind of like humans who are actually on the side of the players, on the side of the island, to provide them a little bit additional assistance. As any good co-op, this game progressively escalates as the game goes on. The challenges increase and the players have to be more efficient in their choices of actions that they take in order to win the game. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Spirit Island as their number 1 board game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 18. The People's Choice number 17 board game of all time is Arkham Horror, the living card game. And Arkham Horror is one of many popular Cthulhu Mythos themed games on the People's Choice Top 100. In particular, it's one of many of the Arkham Horror File games from Fantasy Flight's catalog that made it to the top 100, but it's actually not the most popular. There's a little bit of a spoiler there. It's the second most popular within this line of games. And Arkham Horror the Living Card Game is just that. It's a living card game that recreates the typical tropes of these Cthulhu Mythos games, where players are taking on the role of investigators and they are taking on particular scenarios that come with their own different monsters and bosses. They're going to different locations and having different types of encounters. Now, in this game, players are trying to manage the main resource that is their deck of cards, and they're trying to manage these tokens that represent a currency of sorts, referred to as resources, in order to play down cards in their table area that they'll be able to use. They have different types of cards, like different assets that they can use for particular types of actions. They have different allies that they can use in order to not only get their bonus benefits, but also to use them almost as a shield, as a buffer from attacks from different monsters. And players are trying to partake in different types of skill tests or skill checks, just like in your typical Arkham Horror type of games, except in this game, there's no dice rolling. Instead, you're pulling out tokens from a bag, and you're using these as potential modifiers. And these modifiers can range anywhere from a -4 to a +2 to a guaranteed fail or a guaranteed success, and depending on the difficulty that you set up at the beginning of the game, which determines the pool of tokens that are going in the bag to begin with. Very narrative driven between the different types of cards. You got the agenda cards and the act cards, and you got all these other narrative texts that you read along the course of the campaign. Very immersive experience, and there's a reason why lots of people like it. It's a cooperative game that can also be played very well solo. Arkham Horror, the Living Card Game, last year was actually ranked number 25, so it continues to climb on the list, number 17. This game has been out for a few years, but not too many, so it continues to ascend towards the top. Interesting to see, curious to see where it will rank next year. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Arkham Horror, the Living Card Game, as their #1 game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 17. The People's Choice number 16 board game of all time, and the most popular of all the Cthulhu Mythos themes games, at least for the time being, is Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition by Nikki Valens and Fantasy Flight Games. And it just beat out Arkham Horror by 1 spot. And Mansions of Madness is basically a dungeon crawl style game with a Cthulhu Mythos theme. Players are taking on the role of the investigators, and it's an app-driven game where the app takes on the role of the monsters, the bad guys. It drives forward the narrative and carries out all the upkeep and maintenance that the particular scenarios might require. This game has tons of expansions out there, as many of these successful Cthulhu Mythos themes games are concerned. So there's lots of variety. As a matter of fact, there's a conversion kit that allows you to use lots of the content from the first edition of Mansions of Madness for those who still might find a way of getting that content, although that content is hard to find out of print and pretty costly on the secondhand market. But again, very immersive experience. If you do not mind app-driven type games, then this is a game that you have to consider, especially if you're a fan of this particular genre. Now, Mansions of Madness last year was actually ranked exactly at number 16, so it's still staying in the same exact spot, has not been bumped down. But I'm curious to see, as Arkham Horror, the Living Card Game, continues to be out there and more people are exposed to the game, I'm curious to see if they swap spaces and eventually Arkham Horror, the Living Card Game, becomes the king of the hill as far as the Cthulhu Mythos is concerned. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition as their #1 game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 16. The People's Choice number 15 board game of all time is Viticulture, designed by Alan Stone and Jamie Stegmaier and published by Stonemaier Games. And Viticulture continues. It's an evergreen, has been out for going on 10 years now, and it still continues to climb in the hearts of the people. It's a worker placement game with a wine theme. Players are basically running a vineyard and they're growing grapes, crushing grapes, and converting them into different types of wine and fulfilling contracts, different offers from potential customers in order to gain victory points and money, which is a currency that they can use throughout the game. Now, the game is divided into several rounds, and basically Each round is further divided into seasons. And you've got your two main seasons, which are your summer and winter season, which are basically worker placement seasons. But each round, players have a collective pool of workers that they can use for their actions. So they have to budget accordingly, because whatever workers you use for your spring season are not going to be available for you during your winter season. So you kind of have to map out your entire round ahead of time. Also, at the beginning of each round, you have this interesting spring phase where players are going to, in turn order, basically pick the turn order for the upcoming round, and depending on where they go in the sequence, they're going to get an additional bonus or benefit. So sometimes you might want to go later on in the round if it means that you get a particular bonus. Also, you got this fall season in between all of these where players are going to be drafting different visitor cards that are very useful, helpful cards that trigger different types of actions and in particular scoring points. Really neat. It feels very thematic as you're building the different types of buildings that you need in order to run your vineyard. The nice translucent stones that you place on your board in order to indicate how many crushed grapes you have and how many bottles of wine you have in your cellar. All of these things really contribute to the aesthetic appeal and, again, the thematic immersion of the game. Now, Viticulture last year was ranked number 13. It's only dropped 2 spots, but that's not too bad considering how many new games come out in a year, how many good games come out in a year, and the fact that this game has been around for a long time. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Viticulture as their #1 board game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 15. The People's Choice number 14 board game of all time is Azul. And Azul, designed by Michael Kiesling, is by far the most popular abstract game out there. It's not even close. Some people might not even consider Azul to be an abstract, but I do. Basically, there is no real theme taking place. It's just a bunch of pretty pieces that players are using and manipulating in order to accomplish their particular purpose. In this case, players are drafting these tiles and they're placing them on their setup area on their board, and eventually they will slide them to their main grid, and that's how they're going to score points. They're trying to get different tiles in particular spots. They're trying to get them adjacent to each other, consecutively to each other. They're trying to complete rows. They're trying to complete columns, all in the efforts to score the most points. Pretty simple, very optimal gateway style game, because not only is it a very beautiful, aesthetically appealing game, but it's very simple to learn, and it can really help people go in that direction of abstract games. People quite often don't gravitate to abstract games, but I do find that Azul tends to be an exception to that rule. Azul last year was ranked number 22. So this is a game that is still rising. It came out in 2017, I believe. So it's not too old of a game, but it has been around 5 years, and it's still ascending because more and more people are gravitating towards it, and they're being exposed through these reiterations, these sequels, if we will. You just recently had the Queen's Garden release. But here's the thing. Some of these games are getting votes, but Azul Original, Azul Vanilla, is the one that's getting the most of the votes, the majority of the votes, and the only votes that were factored in for this particular spot, the number 14. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Azul as their #1 board game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 14. The People's Choice number 13 board game of all time is Nemesis. And this is another popular cooperative game ranked very highly on the top 100. And this game, talk about skyrocketing. This game here last year was ranked number 32, and it's climbed up over 20 spots, which at this point of the list is very impressive. This game came out a few years back, and it's really growing in popularity. I see it on all my feeds, on social media, hear about people talking about it and playing it all the time. And basically, Nemesis is a cooperative game, as I mentioned earlier. It's a sci-fi horror-themed style game where players are taking on the role of crew members whose ship has been infested with hostile alien organisms. And these players are all working together to fight back these organisms and ultimately survive. This basically is one of many games out there that kind of recreate the original Alien feel from the Alien movie, where players are on a ship and they're working together to fight back these dreaded, scary-looking aliens. Again, this game growing in popularity. The game has great components, lots of nice miniatures, the graphic design, the artwork. All of this contributes to the immersive experience of the game. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Nemesis as their #1 board game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, It's number 13. The People's Choice number 12 board game of all time is Root. And Root here was ranked number 15 last year, so it's actually climbing up 3 spots. So again, one of these very impressive games that's still not done climbing up the ranks. And Root is basically a war game. It's a war style game, but instead of players taking on the role of different armies from different nations, they're taking on the role of different animal creatures. And this game is highly touted as being the king of asymmetry. This is considered to be the most asymmetric game out there because not only do you have different benefits and powers based on the particular race or the particular creatures that your army represents, but on top of all that, players are going to have radically different winning conditions, end game conditions, depending on the team or the faction that they've chosen. To point out the people here on the screen who have chosen Root as their number 1 board game of all time, as far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 12. The People's Choice number 11 board game of all time, and the last one for today's list, is The Lost Ruins of Arnak. And The Lost Ruins of Arnak just came out back in 2020, so it was still too new to factor into the list for last year, although I do remember it getting some votes. However, this year it has skyrocketed, and I'm pretty sure it is, this is the highest debuting game of all the games on the People's Choice Top 100. As a matter of fact, every other game from here on out are games that have been out for some time now, tried and true favorites, in some of these cases, classics. But Lost Ruins of Arnak is relatively a new game that debuts at number 11. And in Lost Ruins of Arnak, players are basically taking on the role of expedition leaders who are exploring the island of Arnak for different lost artifacts. They're facing fearsome guardians, and they're doing this all in the quest to learn the island's secrets. This game here combines 2 very popular mechanisms, worker placement and deck building, and this is probably a big reason as to why it is such a popular game. Players must manage their resources wisely because certain actions can only be triggered by spending resources, and each turn a player can only take 1 action. Therefore, they must be very shrewd, very wise as they decide and make that one decision because it's the only one they're going to get for that round. I'm very curious to see how this game continues to climb. What can it do, right? Is it going to go down or is it going to climb further? I doubt it's going to retain its spot simply. I think there's going to be some movement taking place, and I'm going to bet right now that this game is actually going to climb a few more spots. It's not done ascending. I'd like to point out the people here on the screen who have chosen The Lost Ruins of Arnak as their number 1 board game of all time. As far as the People's Choice goes, it's number 11. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry at Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what you think about this particular set of 10 games. Which of these games do you enjoy to play? Which of these games are you still hoping to try out? Also, if you're interested, please click on the link on the screen right here and check out my personal 10 favorite board games of all time. And don't miss us next time, as we will finally get to it. We will finally talk about the People's Choice Top 10 board games of all time. That's it for today's video, guys. Thank you for joining us. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.